What happens when the person who is supposed to be your family, the one who smiles at you across the dinner table, is the same person secretly plotting your demise? The story you are about to hear is a chilling testament to the fact that the most monstrous secrets often hide behind the most welcoming facades. It's a tale of greed, deception, and a murder so cold-blooded it will make you question everything you think you know about the bonds of family. We're going to unravel a plot to seize land worth millions. A plot that ended with a beloved patriarch murdered with a hammer, and a daughter-in-law who staged it all. Before we delve into this shocking case, if you appreciate deep dives into the darkest corners of human nature, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these compelling stories. Now, let's travel to the seemingly idyllic Blackwood estate, where a storm of unimaginable betrayal was about to break. The Blackwood land was less a property and more a kingdom. It stretched over 300 acres of rolling Virginia hills, a patchwork of emerald pastures, dense oak forests, and fertile fields that had been in the family since the Revolutionary War. At its heart stood a grand, two-story colonial house, its white paint peeling just enough to look distinguished rather than neglected. This kingdom had only one king, Arthur Blackwood. At 72, he was a man carved from the same ancient oak that dotted his property, sturdy, weathered, and deeply rooted in the soil he so loved. His hands were calloused maps of a life spent working the land, and his eyes, the color of a faded summer sky, held a wisdom that was often mistaken for simple country stubbornness. Arthur had buried his wife, Eleanor, 5 years ago, leaving a silence in the great house that even the chirping of crickets on a warm evening couldn't quite fill. His only son, Thomas, had married a woman from the city, Charlotte, a decade prior. Thomas was a good boy, but soft where Arthur was hard, malleable where his father was resolute. It was Charlotte who had the steel spine in that marriage. She was beautiful, with a smile that could charm a bird from a tree and a mind that was always calculating. From the moment she'd first set foot on the estate, Charlotte had seen not a family legacy, but a price tag. She saw a sprawling, underdeveloped asset, a gold mine being squandered by an old man who still thought a good harvest was the richest treasure of all. In her world of fundraisers, gallery openings, and designer Lab Elsa world, she desperately aspired to fully inhabit 300 acres of prime real estate was the ultimate key. It was a life of effortless luxury, of power, of no longer having to pretend that her husband's modest salary as an architect was enough. Her campaign to seize it began not with a bang, but with a whisper, masked in the guise of love and concern. "Arthur, you shouldn't be out there mending fences all by yourself," she'd say, bringing him a glass of iced tea, her voice dripping with syrupy solicitude. "Let Thomas and I hire a proper team to manage the grounds. You've earned your rest." Arthur would just wipe the sweat from his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand and take the tea. "Rest is for the dead, Lottie. This land needs a Blackwood's touch. Keeps my blood moving." She called him Dad to his face, but to her friends in the city, he was the old man, the single, frustrating obstacle between her and her destiny. Her days at the Blackwood estate were a masterful performance. She learned to bake his favorite apple pie, the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg deliberately wafting through the house to create an illusion of domestic bliss. She would sit with him on the porch in the evenings, listening to his oft-repeated stories about his grandfather building the main barn or the year of the great drought. She'd nod and smile, her eyes reflecting the setting sun, while her mind was busy converting his cherished memories into square footage and zoning permits. Thomas, bless his naive heart, saw only a devoted daughter-in-law. "Isn't she wonderful, Dad?" he'd say, watching as Charlotte carefully weeded Eleanor's old rose garden. "She loves this place as much as we do." Arthur wasn't so sure. He'd seen the way her eyes would sometimes glaze over when he spoke of the past, the flicker of impatience in her otherwise perfect smile. He saw how she subtly steered every conversation about the future towards the financial burden of maintaining such a large property. "The property taxes alone are astronomical," she'd sigh, poring over the bills at the kitchen table, a deliberate act of theater for his benefit. "And the upkeep on the house. A new roof is going to cost a fortune. I worry about you, Arthur. I worry about this place becoming a millstone around your neck. It's not a millstone, it's a legacy, Arthur would reply, his voice firm. It's for Thomas and his children, if you two ever decide to have any. That was another sore point. Charlotte had no intention of cluttering her life with children until she was financially secure on a level Thomas could never provide. The Blackwood land was her baby, her inheritance. The tension escalated one crisp autumn evening. A developer, a slick man in a suit that looked out of place against the rustic backdrop, had been sniffing around the county. He'd made an offer, a staggering sum that made Thomas's eyes go wide. Charlotte had, of course, arranged the meeting, presenting it to Arthur as a mere appraisal for insurance purposes. $8 million, Dad, Thomas said, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and excitement as they sat in the living room. The developer's glossy prospectus laid out on the coffee table. Think of what we could do with that. You could retire anywhere in the world. We could buy a beautiful home in the city, with no leaking roofs or fences to mend. Charlotte placed a gentle hand on Arthur's arm. We'd be set for life, Arthur. All of us. No more worrying. Ever. Arthur looked from his son's eager face to his daughter-in-law's carefully neutral one. He slowly pushed the prospectus away with a single gnarled finger. You're not selling land, he said, his voice low and rumbling like distant thunder. You're selling your grandfather's sweat. You're selling your mother's rose garden. You're selling the stone your own son might one day skip across the creek. You can't put a price on that. He stood up, his tall frame seeming to fill the room. The answer is no. Not now, not ever. This land is not for sale. He walked out, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Thomas looked crestfallen, but Charlotte's eyes held a different emotion. It wasn't disappointment. It was a cold, hard glint of fury. The mask had slipped, just for a second, and in that moment, she looked like a predator whose prey had just escaped the trap. That night, the argument between Charlotte and Thomas was a venomous whisper that carried through the old house's vents. Arthur, unable to sleep, heard snippets from his room below. Stubborn old fool, living in the past. It's our future he's ruining. Charlotte's voice was a hiss. It's his home, Lottie. His decision. Thomas's reply was weak, pleading. Is it? Or is he just being selfish? He won't be here forever, Tom. And what then? We'll be stuck with this decaying museum, too old and too broke to do anything about it. He's tying our hands. The argument was the turning point. Charlotte realized that persuasion and gentle manipulation were failing. The old man was an immovable object. Her approach would have to change. Her kindness became more cloying, her concern more suffocating. She began to talk about his health, subtly planting seeds of doubt in Thomas's mind. Did you notice that tremor in his hand today? She'd ask with a worried frown. And he forgot where he put his keys twice yesterday. I'm just concerned. She started helping him with his work in the barn, a place that had always been his sanctuary. It was a large, cathedral-like structure, smelling of hay, old wood, and motor oil. Tools hung in their designated spots on the walls, a lifetime of order and purpose. His workbench was a sacred space, home to his father's hammer, a heavy claw hammer with a smooth, dark hickory handle, worn to a perfect patina by generations of Blackwood hands. Charlotte would watch him work, her eyes lingering on the heavy tools, on the isolated nature of the barn, set a good 100 yards from the main house. Her search history on the family's shared tablet computer became a diary of her dark intentions. Common causes of death for elderly men, how to stage a fall, head trauma symptoms, and most chillingly, inheritance law Virginia no will. Arthur had a will, a simple one leaving everything to Thomas, but Charlotte knew that with Thomas under her thumb, it was as good as hers. But the will would only matter if Arthur was gone. The week before it happened, she was a whirlwind of activity. She insisted on a family dinner with some old friends from the city, establishing a clear social calendar. She complained loudly to the mailman and the clerk at the feed store about a spate of recent break-ins in the neighboring county, creating a narrative of fear. "You can't be too careful these days," she'd say, shaking her head sadly. "Especially for a man living all alone out here." She was building her alibi brick by meticulous brick. On the final day, a Tuesday, the air was thick with the promise of rain. Arthur had decided to finally fix the loose boards on the hayloft. It was a strenuous job, one he would normally have put off, but Charlotte had been worrying about it incessantly. "It's a death trap, Arthur. Please, let Thomas and me call someone." Her manufactured anxiety had finally goaded him into action. She brought him lunch in the barn around noon, a sandwich and a thermos of coffee. Thomas was in the city for the day, at a meeting she had repeatedly reminded him he couldn't miss. They were alone. "You be careful up there," she said, her smile as bright and brittle as a shard of glass. "I've been climbing this loft since before you were born, Lottie," he chuckled, ruffling her perfectly styled hair. It was a gesture of grandfatherly affection that made her skin crawl. She watched him eat, then saw him climb the ladder to the loft, his movements slower than they used to be, but still steady. She lingered for a moment, her gaze falling on the workbench, on the old claw hammer hanging in its rightful place. The air in the barn suddenly felt cold and heavy. She turned and walked back to the house, her steps measured, her heart a steady rhythmic drum. The afternoon wore on. The sky grew dark, and the promised rain began to fall. A steady drizzle that would wash away any footprints, any evidence of a visitor who wasn't supposed to be there. Around 4 p.m., Charlotte made a phone call to a friend, her voice light and cheerful, talking about a charity event that weekend. At 4:30 p.m., she put on a pair of old garden gloves and slipped out the back door. The walk to the barn was quick. The rain plastered her hair to her head, but she didn't seem to notice. The barn was quiet except for the drumming of the rain on the tin roof. Arthur was not in the loft. He was at the workbench, his back to the door, tightening a clamp on a piece of wood. He was humming an old folk song. He never heard her approach. He never saw the shadow that fell over him. He never saw his father's hammer, the tool that had built and repaired so much on that land, being lifted high in the air. An hour later, as the dusk settled into a deep, wet twilight, Thomas's car crunched up the gravel driveway. He found Charlotte in the kitchen, her face a mask of frantic worry. "Tom, thank God you're home," she cried, rushing into his arms. "I can't find your father anywhere. His lunch plate is still in the barn, and he hasn't answered his phone. I'm so worried, with all those break-ins, and this awful weather." She let him lead the way to the barn, her hand clutching his tightly. She let him be the one to open the big wooden door. She let him be the one whose flashlight beam cut through the gloom and found the crumpled shape on the floor. And she was the one who screamed, a perfect, piercing sound of manufactured horror that echoed across the rain-soaked kingdom she had just conquered. The immediate aftermath of a tragedy is chaos, a maelstrom of flashing lights, crackling radios, and the dispassionate voices of authority. For Charlotte Blackwood, it was the opening night of the most important performance of her life. As the first sheriff's deputies arrived, their tires slicing through the mud, she was the picture of a woman undone by grief. She clung to Thomas, her body racked with sobs that were just a little too theatrical, her face buried in his chest in a way that conveniently shielded her expression from the officers. Thomas was a ghost. His face was slack with shock, his eyes vacant as he stared at the barn, now cordoned off with yellow tape that looked garish against the darkening landscape. He was clay in Charlotte's hands, and she molded his confusion and horror into a narrative that suited her purpose. "It was a break-in," she whispered to the first deputy who took her statement, her voice hoarse and broken. "It has to be. There have been robberies all over the county. I told Arthur. I told him to be careful." She led them through the story she had so carefully constructed. The suspicious vehicle she'd seen on the county road a few days ago. The stories she'd heard at the feed store. The way Arthur, in his stubborn independence, had refused to install a modern security system. Every word was a brushstroke on a canvas of deception, painting a scene of a random, tragic home invasion. Detective Isabella Rossi arrived about an hour later. She was a woman who operated on a different wavelength than the local deputies. Where they saw a grieving family and a robbery gone wrong, Rossi saw a puzzle. She was in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a calm demeanor that often made people underestimate her. She had a knack for seeing the cracks in a story, the tiny inconsistencies that everyone else overlooked. Her first impression of the scene was one of wrongness. The barn was messy, as a workshop should be, but the robbery felt staged. A few drawers on a tool cabinet were pulled out, their contents spilled onto the floor. An old, empty cash box was pried open on the workbench. But the valuable tools, the expensive generator in the corner, the antique saddle hanging on the wall all untouched. It was the work of a remarkably discerning, yet remarkably clumsy thief. Then there was the victim. Arthur Blackwood lay in a way that suggested a surprise attack from behind. The cause of death was brutally obvious. The murder weapon, however, was missing. Rossi's attention turned to the daughter-in-law. She observed Charlotte from a distance at first. She watched as Charlotte remembered a detail for the deputies, her hand flying to her mouth in a gesture of sudden, horrified realization. His wallet. He always kept a spare $100 in his wallet. I bet they took it. It was a good detail, specific and believable. Almost too good. When Rossi finally sat down with Charlotte at the kitchen table, the performance continued. Charlotte had wrapped herself in one of Arthur's old flannel blankets, a prop that screamed vulnerability. She clutched a mug of tea, her hands trembling just so. I can't believe this is happening, she said, tears welling in her eyes. He was such a good man, so strong. I can't understand who would do this. Can you walk me through your day, Mrs. Blackwood? Rossi asked, her voice gentle but firm. Charlotte recounted her day with flawless precision. The morning chores, taking lunch to Arthur, her phone call with her friend, a call she knew would be verifiable, her growing anxiety as the afternoon wore on. I had this awful feeling, she said, her voice cracking. I should have gone to check on him sooner. If I had just... She let the sentence hang, dissolving into another wave of quiet sobs. Rossi let the silence sit for a moment before she asked, You mentioned you were worried about break-ins. Did Arthur keep a weapon for protection? A shotgun, Charlotte answered immediately. An old one. He kept it in the hall closet. She then added, a touch of panic in her voice. Oh my God, you don't think they took it, do you? A quick check by a deputy revealed the shotgun was still there, untouched. It was a subtle misstep. A real thief, one who had just bludgeoned a man to death, would likely have taken a firearm. Rossi's internal alarms were now ringing, soft but persistent. She moved on to Thomas, who was sitting numbly in the living room. His account was disjointed, filled with genuine shock and pain. He was a man adrift in a nightmare, and his story, in its raw, unfiltered grief, was a stark contrast to his wife's polished narrative. He confirmed Charlotte's worries about the break-ins, but he framed it differently. Lottie was really worried. I told her Dad could handle himself, but she was insistent we get more locks. He made it sound like Charlotte's obsession, not a shared, rational fear. While the forensics team combed through the barn, Charlotte made another calculated move. She discovered that some of her own jewelry, a few inexpensive but sentimentally valuable pieces, was missing from the small jewelry box on her dresser. It was a brilliant touch. It broadened the scope of the robbery from the barn to the house, making it seem more desperate and chaotic. It also, crucially, made her a victim, too. They must have come into the house while I was on the phone, she gasped to Rossi. I didn't hear a thing, but the house showed no signs of forced entry. Maybe they came in through the back door? I sometimes leave it unlocked when I'm just in the garden, she offered, providing a convenient explanation. Rossi nodded, her expression unreadable. She knew that in cases like this, the first 48 hours were critical. The story a person tells in the immediate aftermath is the one they have rehearsed the least. But Charlotte's story felt fully rehearsed, as if she had been preparing for this interview for weeks. The real Charlotte, the one hidden beneath the layers of grief, emerged when the police were gone for the night. After a doctor had come and given Thomas a sedative, leaving him in a deep, dreamless sleep, Charlotte was finally alone. The house was quiet. She walked through the downstairs rooms, her bare feet silent on the old wooden floors. She wasn't crying. Her face was calm, her eyes clear and focused. She went to the laundry room. Hidden deep within the hamper, beneath towels and sheets, was a bundle. She carefully unwrapped it. Inside were the clothes she had worn that afternoon, a simple pair of jeans and a dark t-shirt. She took them, along with the gardening gloves, to the large fireplace in the living room. It was a cool night, and a fire would not seem out of place. She laid the logs, crumpled newspaper, and then carefully tucked the clothes and gloves into the center. She struck a match. The flames caught, and as she watched the evidence of her crime turn to ash, a small, triumphant smile touched her lips. The final piece was the hammer. After the murder, she hadn't panicked. She had taken the old hammer to a small, hidden sink in the back of the barn, one used for washing hands and tools, and had scrubbed it meticulously with a stiff brush and solvent. She had paid special attention to the claw and the face, ensuring no trace of blood or tissue remained. She had then used a clean rag to wipe it down, polishing the hickory handle until it shone faintly in the dim light. Finally, she had hung it back on its hook on the workbench, perfectly aligned with the other tools. It was a brazen act of defiance. Hiding the murder weapon was what a panicked killer did. Leaving it in plain sight, cleaned and serene, was the act of someone who believed they were smarter than everyone else. The next few days were a blur of condolences and casseroles. The community rallied around the grieving family. Charlotte played her part to perfection. She was the stoic widow, comforting her distraught husband, making funeral arrangements with a quiet dignity that everyone admired. She spoke to the local newspaper, her voice trembling as she paid tribute to Arthur. "He was the heart of this family, the heart of this land," she said, a quote that would be printed under a picture of her and Thomas, looking bereft. Meanwhile, Detective Rossi was working. The forensics team had found nothing in the barn. No foreign fingerprints, no stray fibers, no footprints in the mud outside other than those belonging to the family and first responders. The rain had been a gift to the killer. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death was blunt force trauma, consistent with multiple blows from an object like a hammer. Rossi was stuck. Every logical path led to a dead end. The robbery theory was flimsy, but there was no evidence to suggest anything else. No one in the community had a grudge against Arthur Blackwood. He was universally liked and respected. The only person who stood to gain from his death was his son, and by extension, his daughter-in-law. Rossi decided to dig into the family's finances. It was a long shot, but it was all she had. She obtained a warrant for their bank records, credit card statements, and computer history. While she waited for the results, she paid another visit to the Blackwood estate, this time unannounced. She found Charlotte in Eleanor's old rose garden, wearing gardening gloves, carefully pruning the bushes. It was a serene, almost painterly scene. "Detective," Charlotte said, her voice filled with weary surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." "Just a few follow-up questions, Mrs. Blackwood," Rossi said, her eyes scanning the garden. "This was your mother-in-law's garden, wasn't it? It's beautiful. You take good care of it." "She loved these roses," Charlotte said, a wistful smile on her face. "I try to keep it up for her. For Arthur." "You seem to be holding up well," Rossi observed. "I have to be strong for Thomas," Charlotte replied, clipping a wilting bloom. He's not handling this well at all." "Grief affects everyone differently," Rossi said. "Some people fall apart. Others get busy. They clean, they organize, they garden. They do anything to keep their hands occupied, to stop their minds from thinking." Rossi's eyes met Charlotte's over the rose bushes. For a split second, Charlotte's pleasant facade faltered. She saw not a sympathetic woman, but a hunter. The look was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by one of sorrowful understanding. "Yes," Charlotte whispered. "That's it exactly. I just need to keep my hands busy." As Rossi drove away from the estate, She couldn't shake the image of Charlotte in the garden, wearing those gloves, her hands methodically cutting away the dead parts of the plants. It was the image of a woman who was an expert at tidying up, at removing anything that was ugly or inconvenient. And Rossi had a growing, sickening feeling that the old man in the barn had simply been something ugly and inconvenient that needed to be pruned away. All she needed now was a single thorn left behind. The crack in Charlotte's perfect facade appeared not as a dramatic shattering, but as a tiny, almost invisible hairline fracture. It came in the form of a data file from the Blackwoods internet service provider. Detective Rossi sat at her desk late one night, a week after the murder, scrolling through pages of technical data, her eyes gritty from lack of sleep. Most of it was mundane social media, online shopping, news websites. But then she saw it. Tucked away in the search history of the family's tablet computer, from 2 weeks before the murder, was a query that made her sit bolt upright. Does hitting someone with a hammer leave fingerprints on the handle? It was followed by a series of other, equally disturbing searches. How to clean blood off wood, best way to stage a robbery, and time it takes for police to get financial warrants. Rossi felt a cold certainty wash over her. This was it. This was the peek behind the curtain she had been looking for. The grieving daughter-in-law, the pillar of strength for her shattered husband, had been researching her crime like a student studying for an exam. The problem was, it wasn't enough. A good defense attorney would argue that anyone could have used the shared tablet. Thomas, a visitor, even Arthur himself. It was damning, but it wasn't definitive. Rossi needed something physical, something that tied Charlotte directly and irrefutably to the act itself. Her mind went back to the crime scene, the barn, the staged mess, the missing weapon. But the weapon hadn't been missing. The forensics team had tested every tool on the workbench for blood, and every test had come back negative. The killer had either taken the weapon with them or had cleaned it with impossible efficiency. Rossi stared at the crime scene photos pinned to a board on her wall. The image of the orderly tool wall, everything in its place, mocked her. And then her eyes landed on the photo of Arthur's father's hammer, hanging on its hook. It was an old, heavy claw hammer. The ME had said the wounds were consistent with just such an object. But it had been tested. It was clean. Too clean, Rossi thought. An idea began to form, a long shot based on a hunch and a memory from a forensic science seminar she'd attended years ago. She picked up the phone and called the head of the forensics lab. "Jim," she said, "I need you to do something for me. That hammer from the Blackwood scene. The old one. I know it came back clean for blood, but I want you to take it apart. I mean, literally take the head off the handle. And when you do, I want you to test the raw wood inside the joint. And check the wedge, the little metal piece that holds it together. Check it for anything. DNA, blood, anything at all." It was a strange request. It meant destroying a piece of evidence, but Rossi was convinced. A killer as meticulous as Charlotte, a killer who researched how to clean blood off wood, would have scrubbed the outside of the hammer until it was sterile. But would she have thought to take it apart? Would she have known that the immense force of the impact could aspirate a microscopic trace of blood spatter not onto the surface, but into the tiny crevice where the metal head met the wooden handle? Rossi was betting she wouldn't. While the lab went to work, Rossi focused on the financial records. They told a story that completely contradicted the image of the contented country wife. Charlotte Blackwood was drowning in debt. There were maxed-out credit cards, secret loans from high-interest lenders, and a string of failed online businesses she had hidden from her husband. She had been funneling money from their joint account into these ventures for years. The $8 million offer from the developer wasn't just a ticket to a life of luxury. For Charlotte, it had been a lifeline she desperately needed to stay afloat before her web of financial deceit collapsed. Arthur's refusal to sell hadn't just been a disappointment. It had been a death sentence for her secrets. Armed with motive and her growing forensic hunch, Rossi brought Charlotte in for a formal interview. Not at the house, but at the station, in a small, sterile room with gray walls and a single table. The change in environment was deliberate. She wanted to strip Charlotte of her stage, of the props of her grief. Charlotte arrived with Thomas, still playing the role of the devoted wife. "I don't understand," Detective, she said, her voice laced with weary confusion. Haven't we told you everything? We just need to clarify a few points on your statement, Rossi said calmly, leading Charlotte into the interview room alone. The performance began as soon as the door closed. The trembling hands, the watery eyes, the quiet sighs of a woman burdened by tragedy. Rossi let her play her part. She started with simple questions, going over the timeline of the day of the murder again and again. She asked about the family finances, and for the first time, Charlotte's answers became evasive. Thomas handles the money, she said dismissively. I'm not much of a numbers person. Really? Rossi said, sliding a folder across the table. Because these statements show you're quite an active numbers person, Mrs. Blackwood. Dozens of online transactions, loan applications. All from accounts Mr. Blackwood doesn't seem to be aware of. The mask flickered, a flash of anger in her eyes. I have my own projects. Thomas is aware. He's just forgetful. Is he also forgetful about you searching for how to clean blood off wood on the family tablet 2 weeks before his father was beaten to death? The color drained from Charlotte's face. The trembling in her hands was suddenly very real. I don't know what you're talking about. We had a mouse problem in the basement. I was looking up how to clean up after that. It was a weak lie and she knew it. The confident performer was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. A mouse problem, Rossi repeated, her voice flat. And the search for, does hitting someone with a hammer leave fingerprints on the handle? Was that for the mouse too? This is ridiculous, Charlotte snapped, her voice rising. You're twisting things. You're trying to blame me for this tragedy. It was then that Rossi's phone buzzed. A text from the lab. It contained a single word, match. Rossi looked up from her phone, her eyes locking onto Charlotte's. We found the murder weapon, Charlotte. That's impossible, she scoffed. You told us you didn't find anything. It was hiding in plain sight, Rossi continued, her voice quiet and steady. Hanging right on the workbench where it's been for the last 50 years. Your father-in-law's hammer. Charlotte almost laughed. You're bluffing. You tested it. You told me it was clean. We did. And you did a remarkable job cleaning it. You scrubbed every inch of the surface. But you're not a forensics expert, Charlotte. You didn't know that when you used it to kill Arthur, the force of the blows would drive microscopic particles of his blood and tissue deep into the wood, into the tiny space where the head joins the handle. You'd have to take it apart to find it. So we did. And we found your father-in-law's DNA. Silence. The hum of the fluorescent lights in the room was deafening. Charlotte stared at Rossi, her mouth slightly agape. The intricate, carefully constructed world she had built for herself was collapsing in on her, beam by beam. The lie was over. She didn't confess in a flood of remorseful tears. There was no apology for the man she had brutally murdered. Her confession came in a torrent of rage, a lifetime of perceived injustices and entitled frustration pouring out of her. He was a stubborn old fool, she spat, her face contorted into a mask of pure hatred. Sitting on a fortune while I had to scrimp and save and lie just to keep us afloat. It was our future. He was already old. He had lived his life. It was my turn. That land was supposed to be mine. The venom in her voice was chilling. It was the raw, unadulterated greed she had hidden for so long behind a beautiful smile and a plate of warm apple pie. In the end, there was no trial. Faced with the forensic evidence and her own recorded confession, Charlotte Blackwood pleaded guilty. Thomas, a broken man, divorced her before the sentencing. He couldn't reconcile the woman he loved with the monster who had murdered his father for a plot of land. He sold a small portion of the property, just enough to pay off the debts Charlotte had hidden, and put the rest into a conservation trust, ensuring that the Blackwood kingdom would remain undeveloped forever. It was the legacy his father had always wanted. Charlotte was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She would trade her view of 300 acres of rolling Virginia hills for a view of concrete walls and barbed wire. She had been willing to kill for a kingdom, and in the end, her entire world was reduced to the size of a prison cell. The viper had finally been caged.